World War II Army comparison. Who had the biggest fleet 1939 to 1946? Let us decide if HOI4 is historically accurate.
Tell you about how the composition, number, and ratio of primary ship types that belong to the rival superpowers of World War II changed battleships, cruisers, destroyers, aircraft carriers, and submarines. The British Royal Navy had 328 ships in their service at the point that war broke out. Combat-ready ships grouped into task forces were distributed across the entire world. In the European waters, the Royal Navy was allied with the French Navy.
That's important to remember that, you know. The British Navy was spread super thin. Look at all the different theaters of war that they were in. Where I suppose for Americans, it was literally Pacific or Atlantic, you know, left on right. And of course, France had a lot of other issues like getting invaded.
Navy, which was the second largest in the world and comprised of 174 ships. The Force de Raid Squadron included the most modern battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Their task was to fight against enemy raiders in the Atlantic Ocean, and the squadron was based in Brest. Another task force was deployed in the Mediterranean Sea. Some ships were also moored at bases on the shores of the Atlantic Ocean, the English Channel in Dakar, and the Indian Ocean. The main adversary of Great Britain and France in the European naval theatre of war until June 1940 was the German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, comprising 103 ships. To grow the number of ships in service and enhance them, the shipbuilding industries of the countries that took part in the conflict had shifted to a prolonged workday by the start of the war and worked tirelessly to supply their country's navies with new ships throughout the entire war. The balance of naval forces was also affected by the changing nature of ground warfare. In June 1940, France capitulated, and its navy ceased all.
This is what's missing out of HOI4. It's telling here about how at wartime factory output was different. And it's interesting in HOI, there needs to be a way of saying whether, I know you can do this a little bit as Japan, but you're focusing on your navy or focusing on ground forces. Sometimes you want to make a really cool navy from basically nothing as Germany or I don't know, maybe Italy or Greece or whatever. But you're able to because it takes quite a long time to get enough naval dockyards to actually build that big navy. There should be some kind of way of saying I'm going to neglect my ground forces or my civilian industry to build like 50% extra output for dockyards or something, just to give you an incentive to actually build a navy. And just an incentive to like divert the attention, whether it's ground stuff or if it's naval stuff, just to actually make you make a navy in the actual time frame of HOI4, which I think that's something that's really missing. If you want to incentivize people, paradox people, listen to this. If you want to incentivize people to make a navy, you need to have options to boost naval output somehow or some way.
1940, and for the entire.
The one element you forget about the Bismarck is they understood, the British Navy, how important this ship was. This was an absolutely massive ship to illustrate the industrial power of the German Reich, and it was kind of more of a morale tool, hence the term flagship. What the purpose of it is, a morale boosting tool. And for the British to actually sink this colossally massive ship results in great victory for the Allies to be able to just sink the unsinkable ship.
Entirety of 1941, the Royal Navy single-handedly battled against the German and Italian navies across a vast area that stretched from Iceland to the Cape of Good Hope. In June 1941, the USSR joined World War II. In June 22, 1941, the Soviet Navy had 272 ships in service, grouped into 4 fleets. Due to the fact that the war between the USSR and Germany was primarily ground-based, the main objectives of the Soviet Navy were supporting the coastal flanks of their ground troops and intercepting enemy communications. Soviet warships were also involved in protecting military cargo convoys crossing from Great Britain to the ports of Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, in close cooperation with the Allied navies. At the cost of tangible losses, the Soviet Navy ensured the safety of maritime trade routes and the success of ground operations. In December 1941, the Japanese aviation offensive on the US naval base in Pearl Harbor forced the Americans to join World War II. On December 7, 1941,
Imagine the Japanese did not do Pearl Harbor. Now, I understand that war in the Pacific was escalating and it had reached a peak with Pearl Harbor, but what would it have looked like if they didn't join the war on the side of the Axis, the Japanese? The war in China would eventually grind the Japanese resources, and eventually the Chinese would have beat the Japanese in China, wouldn't they? Because eventually the Lend-Lease going toward the Allied war effort against the Axis would be then steered towards China to push out the Japanese. So inevitably, the Japanese were going to lose, so that's the reason why they did it. This was basically like, this is our only opportunity. We're never going to get another chance like this. Boom, here we go.
The Imperial Japanese Navy
All in.
comprised 238 ships. The US Navy had 345 ships in service at the moment they joined the war. 3 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese aviation sent British battleship Prince of Wales to the bottom, as well as battlecruiser Repulse in the South China Sea. Great Britain declared war on Japan in response to this. The commencement of warfare in the Pacific Ocean defined the importance.
Hang
In
on.
response to this, in the sent British battleship Prince of Wales
Japan attacked the British Navy.
to the bottom, as well as battlecruiser Repulse in the South China Sea. Great Britain declared war on
This was the catalyst that caused Britain to declare war on Japan. Oh, wow. Okay.
Japan in response to this. The commencement of warfare in the Pacific Ocean defined the importance of naval aviation. At first, Japan had more aircraft carriers than the USA, 6 versus 3. As soon as May 1942, the first battle involving aircraft carriers took place in the Coral Sea.
Am I right in thinking that the Japanese aircraft carriers weren't as technologically advanced as the American ones, though? They couldn't support as many sorties. Am I right in thinking that? Comment below.
During which the Japanese sank one of 2 US carriers involved in the battle. However, the losses of the Japanese in the Coral Sea, 1 destroyed aircraft carrier and 1 damaged, stopped them from attacking New Guinea and played a major role in the next battle near Midway Atoll. That battle would determine the tide of the war in the Pacific Ocean. The combatants from the Japanese side were 4 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, 12 destroyers, 248 deck aircraft, and 16 seaplanes. The US forces comprised 3 aircraft carriers, 7 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, 15 destroyers, 16 submarines, 233 deck aircraft, and 127 ground-based.
I was right. Look, the American ones could have more planes and more sorties overall. I was right. They were larger aircraft. I say technologically advanced, but that might just be they're larger carriers, so they can have more deck space, so therefore they can have more planes.
Airplanes. During the 3-day battle, the Imperial Japanese Navy lost all of their aircraft carriers, 248 airplanes, and a heavy cruiser. The Americans lost aircraft carrier Yorktown, 150 airplanes, and a destroyer. The year 1942 was marked in European waters by Allied naval activities focused.
What's kind of interesting about the Pacific War is it just shows how the battles were so unbelievably long range. See right there, there were so many ships actually involved in the battle, but actually very few of them actually engaged each other, just because most of the battles were being fought over with the carriers flying their planes long distances to either bomb or torpedo. I think that's something I think is forgotten a lot of the times, because I think when you think of war, you think of like World War One and what was this big battle that happened here in World War I between Germany? It was a massive slugfest of like heavy capital ships firing at heavy capital ships. It's like the biggest naval battle in history, I believe. I guess it was a win for Britain and the Entente, but overall it was like there wasn't really a clear victor from both of it. But I suppose the Pacific War is different because of the ability to use long-range carriers. Jutland, that's it, yeah, the Battle of
in
Jutland.
the Northern Atlantic Ocean, including Arctic convoys, fighting along communication lines in the Mediterranean Sea, and landing troops in North Africa. Germany had increased their number of submarines over that period, which allowed them to attack Allied convoys in the Northern Atlantic Ocean successfully. In 1942, German submarines sank 1,245 ships, while just 84 submarines were lost. In 1943, the war at sea changed in favour of the Allies in the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, the main naval theatres of World War II. Several key factors facilitated that. First of all, the colossal industrial machine of the US was mobilised for military needs and reached its full capacity, which provided a massive scale of production. Second, mass implementation and usage of state-of-the-art military and technical equipment in the Navy, such as radar and sonar. Finally, the Allies, and the US in particular, achieved absolute supremacy in the air, thus confirming naval aviation to be the main naval strike force. Until
This is the turning point, isn't it? 1943, the production of the Allies had gotten so unbelievably high, there is no way the Axis could have turned it around. The war technically ended in 1943.
German High Command were sure that they were destroying Allied ships faster than the Allies were constructing them. That was true. During the initial stages of the battle for the Atlantic, the efficiency of submarines was very high. A single submarine could destroy 4 ships on average during a single combat raid, and submarine construction rates were quite high in Germany. Germany had 57 submarines by September 1st, 1939, and 1,099 more submarines of various types came into active service for the Kriegsmarine during the war. On average, a new submarine entered service every 2 days. At the same time, the construction rates of new transports, primarily in the USA and Canada, had also increased. By 1943, an average of 3 ships were put afloat every day. Convoy.
Was this the strategy then? They were producing more convoys than possible for the Germans to even sink? That seems like almost like a bad strategy. It's like, we're just going to outproduce you.
Protection had been
I guess
also
if you're
improved.
able to, I guess.
Special escort and anti-submarine ships were mass-produced in Great Britain, the US and Canada. In 1943, Italy capitulated, and their navy ceased to pose a threat to the British forces in the Mediterranean Sea. In December of the same year, German battleship Scharnhorst attempted an attack on a convoy travelling to the USSR. She was destroyed by British ships. From that moment on, the Kriegsmarine were left with just a single battleship, Tirpitz, which was destroyed by British aviation in 1944.
Not a lot of talk about Tirpitz, is there? You know, because it's the sister ship to the Bismarck. So for the most part, the armament and the tonnage was the same, right? But it was mainly in the Mediterranean theater, wasn't it? I feel like you hear less and less about this ship, and everyone's always talking about the famous raid on the Bismarck.
The Americans launched their offensive on the islands occupied by the Japanese in the Pacific Ocean. Their navy took an active part in the landing of troops and suppressing enemy coastal defenses with artillery fire. The Imperial Japanese Navy made numerous attempts to hamper the advance of the American troops, but they suffered significant losses in battles, both large and small. In June 1944, the Battle of the Philippine Sea took place. It resulted in the total destruction of almost all Japanese naval aviation. In October of
Oh wow, look at that. Look at the losses on on the Allied side.
Of almost
I don't think these are all American, are they? Some Allied ones here?
all Japanese naval aviation.
It feels like there's too many carriers here. So all they lost, the Allies, were planes. That was it. That just shows how unbelievably long distance these battles actually were. This idea of this big slugfest of firing close-range cannons from ships is just bullshit. It is just long-range torpedo attacks.
In October of the same year, the Japanese Navy suffered a devastating defeat in the largest naval battle of World War II, Leyte Gulf. The outcome of that dramatic battle, which lasted almost 4 days, was the destruction of all 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, 3 battleships, including Yamato's sister ship Musashi, 8 cruisers and 12 destroyers.
Super heavy battleship.
The USA lost 3 carriers and 3 escort ships. In a desperate attempt to withstand the assault of the US Navy, the Japanese employed the kamikaze tactic for the first time.
15K versus 200.
The final large-scale battle, if it can be called that, between the Japanese and the US navies resulted in the sinking of Yamato in April of 1945. The battleship, escorted by a cruiser and 8 destroyers, was tasked with preventing the American forces from landing on Okinawa Island. The USA sent 11 aircraft carriers to destroy the battleship. 3 aviation groups, with a total number of 394 planes, participated in Yamato's destruction. By the spring of 1945, the German Navy had basically been destroyed. The majority of their primary surface ships had been sunk in battles, and the remaining, badly damaged ships were no longer useful in combat.
The invasion of Norway by Germany was devastating for the Kriegsmarine. They lost so many screening ships and escort ships that it put them out of actually effectively using their navy for like over 2 years of the war. And for the most part, I guess you could even argue that put them out of the main naval conflict for the rest of the war. The only real thing they were able to do was to raid convoys with submarines. Hence the reason why they had their unorthodox doctrine of undefended capital ships raiding, like the Bismarck raiding convoys as a ship, which is just an unorthodox strategy, which, as we know now, the fate of the Bismarck is that it didn't work.
45. The Kriegsmarine...
It makes me think if they had enough escort ships, whether the Bismarck would have been escorted, or it was just done because of desperation, I guess.
High Command gave the order for all of their submarines to cease combat. 156 submarines surrendered to the Allies. World War II ended on September 2nd, 1945, with the Japanese signing the act of capitulation on board US battleship Missouri. Japan had lost almost their entire navy by competing against the USA and Great Britain in terms of the number of ships in service prior to the war and trying to surpass these countries in the quality of their ships. The same happened to Germany in Europe. The dream of becoming a worthy opponent of Britain by outdoing Italy and France turned out to be a complete disaster. The USA became the main naval superpower, while Great Britain preserved their second spot with a great lead over all other contestants. But there was no need to keep such huge navies after the war, so both naval superpowers placed their ships into reserve, sent them to be mothballed or scrapped them for metal due to economic reasons. By contrast, with the first two naval superpowers, the naval forces of the USSR had played only a secondary role during the war, and their numbers hadn't changed a lot. The Soviet Union launched a large-scale program for creating a great navy after the conclusion of the war. Many of the ships that took part and had key roles in the sea battles of World War II.
GG, don't forget to like and to subscribe. And if you want more of this kind of content, why don't you give this video a try? This one right here. Yep, see it? Click it. That's the videos next.